What's up, Scavengers? And Scandinavia here. It feels like it's been ages since I recorded, so I'm so happy to actually get back to it. In this video, I'll show you the basics on how to make a wooden Formicarium for your ants. Wooden Formicariums are, in my opinion, some of the most underrated Formicarium types. They provide not only with an extremely naturalistic environment for the ants, but also can be quite beautiful looking. That being said, wooden nests are not well suited for every single species of ant out there. Remember that in wooden nests you cannot have a hydration chamber, since it will deform the wood and cause mold growth. This means that the ants going inside has to be wood dwellers to some degree, or rather hardy species in general. For example, I don't think Cmeister would do so well in a wooden nest. Although a rather hardy species, they seem to enjoy mid-humidity in their chambers, as well as them being made out of soil and not wood. What I want to say is basically, these nests are not for beginners, as they require some background knowledge of ant behavior, as well as some knowledge of the specific species that's going inside. Arboreal species like Temnothorax, Polarachis and Cmeister seem to thrive in wooden nests, however. Enough talking, let's get right into how I built this nest. So let's start off with some things that you will need. The bulk of this method that I will be using relies on a Dremel tool like this one you see here. Having said this, you can of course use a drill, CNC, milling tool or whatever works for you. After your preferred tool, in this case a Dremel tool, you will obviously need some hard and dry wood piece and some acrylic glass to go on top. I will also be using these tungsten carbide bits for my Dremel to do the rough work. These bits might be rather expensive up front, but are extremely useful and last a very long time. I will also be using these, a bit finer carbide tips for detail work and smoothing of the chambers. In addition to this, some sandpaper is also needed, in order to make mainly the outside of the nest smooth and nice. But of course also the chambers inside if you can fit the paper. I will be using P180 and P400 grit for this. Some safety glasses are of course important when you're doing the rough woodwork with the tungsten carbide bits. Finally, the secret for making any wooden nest beautiful is raw, cold press linseed oil. Very important that it is both raw and cold press for best result. Alright, with the main tools and items out of the way, we can start making the nest by sketching out the chambers. As you watch that process, I can go over some extra points that I wanted to mention. So, why I chose a Dremel is since I personally really like the freedom of a Dremel tool and the naturalistic feel to the final chambers. But as I said before, anything that can make holes in wood should work fine. As you will see later in the video, I'm using this super solid and hard wood that came from old furniture. When picking wood to work with, I would avoid using any of the softer types, as it might be a bit risky to keep certain tree digging species inside. I'm looking at you, Camponotus. Alright, as you've seen in the background now, I started out by making a sketch onto the wood, in order to have a plan. When making a sketch, remember not to place the chambers too close to the edge of the piece, since it is always smart to have a slight buffer zone from the chambers and the outside to prevent escaping ants. As you see here, I started to roughly carve out the main chambers with the rougher tungsten carbide bits. I made sure to break the surface of the wood on any of the spots that I plan on making a chamber or path, since it will make it easier to see where you should carve. Alright, with the rough carving done, it is time to make the chambers deeper. For this I again used the tungsten carbide tip, and as you see, it's starting to look like a nest. Remember that you can always make changes to your sketch whilst carving, something that I do all the time. Now, it's time to smoothen out the chambers and paths. I switched out to this elongated, smaller and finer carbide tip and got to work. The key to making a nest look good is, in my opinion, the initial sketch. For this nest, I feel like I got inspired by LAKEY's nests, and their very elongated chambers, but also how Temnothorax makes little ledges inside of the chambers. It's always a good idea to take a good look at some real ant nests when making your design, and keep in mind what species is going inside as well. When making this nest, I was planning for it to be for either a LAKEY's or a large Temnothorax colony. Alright, with the first chamber smoothing done, this is now how it looked. So after this, I switched to the more round ball carbide bit, and made the paths more continuous and smooth. Now it was time to connect these two chambers with tunnels, and this unconnected part with the other. I wanted to have some tunnels for a more interesting nest, which forces you to look a bit closer to see it all. I did this by simply drilling on one side, on a slight angle into the wood, and then met it up from the other side, also drilling with a slight angle. After that, I widened the hole with both the drill and some carbide tips, enough for a large LAKEY's queen or something to get through. With that all done, the carving was now over, and we can move on to the making of the entrance. I drilled the entrance a bit below the chambers and then measure if it's deep enough to be connected. I then used a smaller drill to connect the chambers to the new entrance. And there we go. Now we only have the sanding, oiling and glass to do. I used the P180 grit paper for the first smoothing of the sides, and then stepped it up to the much finer P400 paper. Remember that when you're sanding the side, which the glass is going on, make sure you use something already flat to sand with, so that you get a good and consistent flat surface without any dips. Otherwise, there's a risk of ants escaping. Finally, I used a piece of the P400 paper to sand the upper edges of the chambers. Alright, with it all being sanded and done, it was time to move on to the oiling. This step actually both has a practical and an aesthetic result. So make sure to get your hands on some raw, cold pressed linseed oil before making a bunch of nests. I mean, this is at least the oil that I'm using, and there might be other alternatives. Oiling your wooden nest first of all makes the wood extremely gorgeous, since it darkens the wood and shows the grains and the texture extremely well. Secondly, oiling your wood is a good idea since it helps keep the humidity inside the nest, which is obviously a huge plus. Now, I chose to only oil the outside of the nest, but you can also oil the chambers. I didn't choose to do that on this piece, however, since keeping the chambers a bit brighter color really made them pop with this wood. In some other wooden nests that I have made, I have also oiled the chambers, but this one really looked good with a dry chamber, in my opinion. The oil should be all soaked in after 1 minute or so. If there's any blobs of oil still left, make sure to remove it with a cloth. Alright, let's move on to the final step, the glass. Now, as you can see, I had my acrylic glass already cut out, but it is really simple to do if you look it up. A very important detail that I do want to mention, however, is the type of acrylic that you are using. I have used many different acrylic glass, and some crack when you screw on the glass onto the nest, and if the pressure onto the acrylic is uneven. What I'm using here is polycarbonate glass. There are different types out there, but this one does not crack as easily as the others. There of course might be other types that don't crack either, but I will however stick to my polycarbonate since I know that this works. Alright, so I clamped on the glass onto the nest, and then drill holes for the screws. This is important since otherwise the screw might actually crack the wood, because of the wood being so solid. Note that I'm drilling with a drill slightly thinner than the screws, so that they still will get traction inside the wood. Always make sure to try this out a few times on a spare piece, since you will have to adjust the drill that you are using depending on what screws you will be using. So make sure everything works on a spare piece first. Now you also see me here go over a second time with a bit thicker drill. This is only for the glass and for the absolute top of the hole in the wood. This size of drill is large enough for the screw to fit through easily. Widening the hole in the glass even more is done to make sure that the glass doesn't crack either. Now, all that was left to do was to take away the bottom safety plastic and screw it on. I kept the top plastic on, since you might accidentally scratch the glass when screwing, something that I sadly know from experience. Remember to not screw in the screws 100%, but instead screw in one a bit and then move to another. This is done to make sure that the plastic do not bend too much as the screws are pushed down on it. And boom! It's all done. Alright, thank you so much for watching, and I hope I inspired you to make some wooden nests. Now, remember that these nests are not well suited for every single ant species, but instead you have to know a bit about your specific species to know if they can handle a wooden nest without a hydration chamber. That being said, however, most species will do fine in a wooden nest, as long as they have access to water through another source. Be sure to DM me on my Instagram @ants_Scandinavia if you have any questions, or if you decide to make a wooden nest. I'm really curious to see what you guys make. Also, thank you so much for 8,000 subscribers. It's awesome to see how this channel grows, and I'm so grateful that you like what I do. I know I should upload more, but I try my best to post whenever I can. Alright, see you around, Scavengers. Bye!